Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. My name is Pastor Siri. I'm a Lutheran pastor and a spiritual seeker. And today I'm going to talk about why women can be pastors. Now, if that automatically triggered you and your first response is to quote one of three very obvious Bible verses about women and being quiet in church and not teaching men, just pause for 1 second. This video is really for people who aren't aware that there is a biblical and theological argument for the ordination of women. I'm not even really trying to change your mind, but so many people are ignorant of the very faithful reasons in why many denominations have finally gotten out of the way of women being able to hold leadership positions within the church. And so that's really what this video is about. This perspective is often drowned out by men who are thumping the Bible, telling women to sit down and shut up, as they've been doing for literally thousands of years. It's boring, it's exhausting, it's basic. If you want to hear another alternative, keep listening. So a while ago, it's been around for a while, but there was a meme that said, "Women pastors, what do you do when you come across the Bible verse that says that women should be quiet in church?" And to me, the meme in and of itself is so unbelievably condescending. Women, what do you do when you come across? As if women are like opening the Bible for the first time because, right, progressives never have anything to do with the Bible. We just threw that out with the bathwater, right? Going through the Bible and just like, oh my, I'm going to rethink my entire career and all of my life choices because I didn't read this one very obvious Bible verse. Oh, here's one more very obvious Bible verse. The argument against women ordination and the argument for the subjugation of women is so old and so tired. It has been heard over and over and over again because that's basically what men have been insisting for thousands of years. Believe me, we've all heard it and we get it. So instead, let's look at something else. First of all, quoting the Bible is literally the easiest, simplest, most black and white 5th grade level of understanding the Bible. There's a lot of things you can quote in the Bible. Literally a lot of really awful things you can quote in the Bible, as atheists often know. There's two in particular that people will often throw out. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, it says that women should be silent and not teach men. So this has often been the reason why women could teach Sunday school. They can teach children, but the minute that boys get to a certain age and become men, now women have to kind of stay in their little corner. Now, what you have to know about this actual verse is context. Context, shocking. You have to do a little bit of homework to understand the Bible. So in the time in which this was written, most women were denied an education. So they weren't educated. They couldn't read. They hadn't maybe been able to develop some of those critical thinking skills. And so in a new congregation where the men were educated and women were not, it is possible that women were asking some really basic questions that might have been slowing things down. And so that might have been one reason why this particular verse was included in the letter, was just to say, hey, we'll have this great intellectual conversation about Christianity, but women, you should really, we can have like a basic class later or talk to your husbands about it or something like that. It is condescending, assuming that women aren't educated, but if they weren't, there you go. But as women become educated and as women learn more about themselves, the world, science, math, everything, as they've gotten credentials and education, then this doesn't actually make any sense unless you're just trying to be misogynistic and sexist and say there's something fundamentally wrong with women, but we'll get to that later. The other one is 1 Corinthians 14 that says that women should be silent in church. Again, it's the exact same thing. It is important to remember that the Bible was written in a very particular culture and time. And as much as we'd like to think otherwise, often the people who were writing the Bible were a product of their culture. And so Paul who was steeped and raised in a very patriarchal and sexist society, would have really struggled to get outside of that. But as you're going to see in a little bit, Paul was probably a little bit more of a feminist than you actually think, because the early church was a little bit more egalitarian and radical than most of us have actually been led to believe. But those things aren't obvious. And see, that's what a lot of people like, is they like obvious quotes that they can hang on to. When in reality, a mature way to look at the Bible is to look at the narrative of the Bible, to look at stories, to look at what truly, truly continues to come up as big, overpowering themes. And honestly, in all of the New Testament, subjugating women is actually not that big of a theme, but the opposite really is. So even in the Old Testament, which again is deeply patriarchal and has some very misogynistic parts to it, there are moments in which incredibly radical stories of women leading pop out. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will say, for example, in the book of Judges, where you have male judge after male judge, and these are elected by God to lead the people for a particular time, you have the story of Deborah. And this is a woman who is highly respected, who is judging all of Israel. And when it's time to go to war, her commanding officer, Barak, will not go into war without her. It is this beautiful little story that shows that, yes, God has chosen women to lead. And maybe that was sort of a one-off, but it is really a difficult argument to say that God would never want a woman leader when you continue to have stories like this that show that women are actually very, very capable. Another example of this may be the leadership of Esther with her people, the beautiful story of Ruth and Naomi, which is really centered on their beautiful, gentle love for each other. And Ruth was not even a Jewish person. And this is a great example of how in the Bible, we're over and over again have our expectations that these are the faithful people, these are the smart people, this is the way it is. And then you have these stories that just will not let you stay in that narrative. God is always breaking out of our constricted narrow-mindedness. And a beautiful example of this is the way that Jesus behaves towards women and really most people throughout the Bible. We can start actually with the Magnificat in the beginning of Luke. The whole focus in the first few chapters of Luke really focuses on women. It is Mary and it is Elizabeth, and time is marked by Elizabeth's pregnancy. And Mary has this beautiful moment where the angel comes to her and asks for permission to have the Son of God. And she says yes. And then she gives this amazingly powerful testament that we call the Magnificat to God favoring the lowest people, right? God is not about hierarchy. God is not establishing a dominance. And yet so often people want to cling to that and use that against people who are already experiencing oppression. Well, then let's go to Jesus, because the way that Jesus interacts with pretty much every single woman in all four Gospels is absolutely radical for the time. In that time, a Jewish rabbi would not have women disciples, and yet we know he did. Mary Magdalene was one of them. We see this in the Gospel of Luke. It says Mary and other women followed Jesus and provided him out of their means. These were independent, smart women who followed Jesus. They were the same disciples who were there when Jesus died on the cross. When all of the men ran away, the women were there at the cross. Therefore, they got to be there at the resurrection. And then, of course, Jesus specifically chose Mary Magdalene on Easter morning in the Gospel of John to be the one to preach the very first Christian sermon that ever existed. Jesus is risen. Jesus is alive. So really, and this has been affirmed by so many theologians, I'm not making any of this up, Mary Magdalene was the first pastor as ordained by Jesus Christ. And yet somehow all of this, all of the actions and the ways that Jesus engaged with women has been completely tossed and diminished. And we throw out 1 Timothy and Corinthians and maybe one or two other little verses. But I have even more. In John 4, Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at the well. She is an outsider. She is a woman. This is someone that a Jewish man would not engage with. And not only does he engage with her, but he has a theological conversation with her. And when she pushes back, at no point does he tell her that she should be silent, shut up, and sit down. He never does, ever. In Luke 10, one of my favorite stories, Jesus goes to the house of Mary and Martha, friends, they're sisters. Martha is in the kitchen, a typical women's role, and she is preparing a meal for the visitors. But where is Mary? She's sitting at the feet of Jesus, which is code for what men did, what disciples did. They sat at the feet of their rabbi and they learned. Mary was jumping traditional female roles, which conservatives love to say are somehow ordained by God. Jesus himself is watching a woman jump roles. And when her sister points it out and says, make her come into the kitchen to do this female role with me and help me out, Jesus does not comply. In fact, he says, she's actually chosen a really good thing. I'm not going to tell her squat. So Jesus uplifts her ability to her desire to learn, her desire to be like a disciple, as he does with the other women disciples. Do you want another story? I'm going to give you another story. There's multiple accounts, slightly different name, in which Jesus withdraws and has a little Sabbath time away from the Jewish people. And while he's in Gentile territory, a Syrophoenician woman, sometimes called someone different, comes into the house where he's at and has a child that needs healing. And initially, Jesus responds in a very traditional Jewish way. He's like, I'm here for the Israelites, the children of God. I'm not here to, feed the dogs. And that was very much like what Jewish people would have called people who were not Jews, which is very derogatory, but that would have been timely. No one would have questioned that. The woman doesn't even question that, but she does push back. And she says, yes, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the children's table. At this point, Jesus also does not go, woman, sit down, shut up, know your place. He says, you know what, you're right, your faith is great, your child is healed. And from then on, he starts spending time in Gentile territory because she taught him something about the ability to have faith in Gentile territory. You cannot tell me that Jesus was not an egalitarian feminist open-minded person, and that the way that he interacted with every kind of class of people who were traditionally marginalized and oppressed in the religious system, Jesus always behaves in a way that is above and beyond. And yet somehow today, 2,000 years later, we have Christianity is very well known around the world in so many places as being a sort of oppressive, hierarchical, all about power and control, subjugating women, blah, blah, blah. So contrary to popular belief, once we actually get to the letters of Paul and throughout after the Gospels, there is evidence, plenty hiding throughout the letters and Acts that women were leaders in the early church. Once again, these are not easy Bible quotes that you can pick out to throw at somebody. You actually have to read the Bible, and you actually have to see it as a narrative. And so here we go. We begin in the book of Acts. So we begin with Tabitha, or Dorcas, depending on the Greek or Jewish name. She's from Joppa and was well known for her works of charity and kindness. She is so important that when she dies, Peter's asked to come and attend to her, and he raises her from the dead. She is the only woman who is explicitly given the name disciple in the book of Acts. Next, we meet Lydia of Philippi in Acts 16. An independent, wealthy woman, she's already formed a group of like-minded women who study and worship by the riverside. When she hears Paul speak, she single-mindedly is persistent, so much that he ends up staying with her. He kind of resists her at first for reasons we don't know, but eventually gives in. And she becomes a place of refuge for him in Philippi and is the one responsible for the start of the Philippian church. Just a few chapters later, Aquila and Priscilla, a husband and wife team, appear in a few references. They are Jews from Rome, Italy, who were refugees in Corinth. They become friends with Paul, doing the same sort of work of tent making. They accompany him on one of his journeys and even educate a preacher named Apollos after he speaks about the way incorrectly. Clearly, both husband and wife were intelligent and worthy of their status, well remembered in the early community. We next move on to some seemingly insignificant references at the end of Paul's letters. We can overlook how powerful it is that Paul casually mentions women as leaders of the church when he's saying, "Greet these people for me in the name of Christ." In Romans 16, Paul mentions several women. Phoebe is a deacon of the church. Prisca and Aquila are mentioned again. There is a Mary named and a Junia who is in prison with Paul. He calls her prominent among the apostles, along with a man named Andronicus. It's also important for you to know that in Middle Ages, there was a scribe who was so offended that a woman was called an apostle that he changed the name to a male named Junius for literally hundreds of years. This was an intentional cover-up that reveals that it was difficult for the later church to reconcile women as leaders. We would like to believe that the church has only made important decisions based on reading the Bible. But unfortunately, the opposite has happened. Important decisions are made. The Bible is often used to defend those decisions, and all evidence to the contrary is minimized. And there's plenty of examples of how that has happened. But let's keep going. Still, in Romans 16, Paul goes on to reference the workers of the Lord. Tryphenia and Tryphosa, 2 women. Other women are named after this as part of the congregation. And then in Philippians 4, there's a letter to the church that Lydia started, and he references Euodia and Syntyche, naming them as 2 people who have struggled with him in the work of the gospel, along with a few other co-workers. There is no reason to assume their position was less than the others just because they were women. In Colossians 4, Paul sends a greeting to Nympha and the church in her house. Once again, we see a woman who has some measure of power in this congregation, even if she's just provided a place where the church meets. I mean, why wasn't her husband named? Did she not have a husband? But she's the one mentioned, and Paul is crediting her. So you put this all together and you realize that the early church followed Jesus' lead by having women in ministry and treating them at least a little bit as equals for a little bit of the time. And this would have been a shocking shift from the patriarchal cultures in which Christianity was being birthed. So much that there's evidence of pushback against it. There's stories of Peter's jealousy of Mary Magdalene's high position in the early church, possibly revealing a larger argument on the place of women in the early church. In fact, writers such as Bishop Cyprian of Carthage remarked that Christianity was so predominantly women and unmarried elite women that he saw it as problematic. Some saw this as a reason that Christianity was foolish. St. Augustine, active in the 400s, wrote that the average Christian female was more educated in spiritual matters than many a philosopher. It's possible that the Christian faith started out so egalitarian that women flocked to it for the freedom that they found. And these women were not silent or silenced, at least not in the beginning. So again, you can pull out those 2 little verses, but they seem to be paling in the mounting biblical evidence of the absolute opposite. Eventually, we know that men won the day. Jesus' encounters with women were diminished to be sermons about how Jesus redeemed these lost women. And verses such as 1 Timothy 2, which seem in sharp contrast to everything that I have just talked about for the last 10 minutes, became elevated over all of that. So in the early faith of Christianity, where Jesus had women followers, where Jesus chooses them to be apostles, witnesses to his resurrection, and leaders, there is no greater dismissal to them than for us to tell them to just be quiet and sit down and let the men take it from here. So a final question, though, is when we read the Bible, there's so much in it. So what is the lens in which you approach the Bible? The lens, I believe, should start with Jesus. And it should start for God so loved the world that. It should start with that boundary-breaking love and compassion that Jesus showed for all different kinds of people. Also, Jesus reminds us again and again that the heart of all scripture, the heart of all religion and teaching, is to love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as well as yourself. That should be the measure in which we read everything. And so if the Bible has been using in defense of oppression of another people, especially marginalized and people with less power, we're using it wrong. We're using it in a way that is deeply disturbing and problematic. The Bible has also been used to defend all sorts of horrific things. So just because you can pull a Bible quote out of your butt does not mean that that is a good thing to do. The Bible was used to defend slavery by pastors for a very long time. But also, pastors who were abolitionists were also using the Bible to say that slavery was wrong. It depends on the lens that you're bringing with you. So the last thing I'm going to say about the Bible is this. If you are using the Bible to subjugate other people, to dominate, to silence another human being, you're using it wrong. In the stories of Jesus in the wilderness, the devil quotes scripture at Jesus to manipulate and bait him. So do not do that. The Bible is not a weapon, nor should it be used to shackle a fellow human being. The Bible is meant to be of service to the liberating way of Jesus, and if it isn't, it is worthless. And that's not heresy to say. Heresy is making an idol of the Bible and using it to control, demean, and dehumanize other beings. The Bible is meant to be a mirror for your own spiritual development, not a bludgeon to control other people. I'm not quite done yet. So historically speaking, as I said, for quite a few hundred years, women actually were leaders in the church. And then when Constantine came to power and began to convene several councils, like the Council of Nicaea and Constantinople, where they made some really big decisions about Christianity, no women were invited to that. And pretty soon, women bishops, which we have archaeological evidence of through mosaics and writings, all of a sudden that just disappeared. And yet women kept finding ways to show their capability and their spiritual authority where they could. We have unbelievable examples of Clare of Assisi, who was the spiritual advisor to St. Francis of Assisi, Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote an unbelievable amount of music, as well as ran all sorts of convents for women and made amazing decisions, was constantly told no by men, ignored them, did it anyway, and she's the one that everybody remembers. Julian of Norwich, who had visions of God, on and on and on. There have been women in Christianity in the last 2,000 years who have proved themselves unbelievably spiritually capable and having amazing authority to help shape large groups of people. The last thing I want to say is that while men have run the church, a lot of horrible things have happened. While men have run the world, a lot of horrible things have happened. Our history is littered with corruption and nepotism and war and war and war, and a lot of misuse of power and dehumanization of women and other people and dominating and sucking dry the resources of our planet. So I don't really feel that men have a moral high ground that they can say that they're naturally endowed with a spiritual authority just because of the body they happen to be born in. Maturity, wisdom, connection to God, and the ability to love and serve your neighbor, that is the markers of spiritual authority, which can be found in both women and men alike. While it's infuriating to think how Christianity could have been different if women had not been edged out intentionally by men who were seeking power, now women are finally rightfully claiming their place in the pulpit and in other places of leadership. We can also see, I feel, that the burden of proof is really not on women to justify their being allowed to preach, but on men denying them this right. When women become pastors, we're not allowing them. You're getting out of the way. You're following Jesus. And as Christians, that's what we're supposed to do. Thanks for listening.